The adoption papers were still on my table when someone started pounding on my door, hard enough to shake the frame. Then he said my niece's name like he already owned it. We hadn't told anyone what we named her. No one. My stomach dropped. I opened the door just a crack and froze. A man I'd never seen was standing there, holding a photo of her as a newborn. Same birthmark, same face. But the date on it, 3 days before I even knew she existed. My chest went tight. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my dead sister's number. The one we shut off after the funeral. It said, "Don't let him take her." I looked back at the man and he stepped closer, calm, too calm. "You've had her long enough," he said. "Now give me my daughter." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a secret my sister took to her grave, and now it was at my door. The knocking didn't stop even after I froze with my hand on the lock. Not polite or hesitant, but hard enough to rattle the frame. And then he said my niece's name through the door. Clear, certain, like it belonged to him. And something in my chest went tight because we hadn't told anyone outside the family what we'd named her. Not neighbors, not friends, no one, which meant he didn't learn it from us. I kept the chain on and cracked the door just enough to see him, mid-30s maybe, unshaven, holding a photograph between his fingers. And before I could ask who he was, he pushed it forward slightly and said, "You've had her long enough." His voice steady, but his hand not quite. A faint tremor running through it like he was forcing himself to stay calm. My fingers went cold because the baby in that picture was her. I knew it instantly. The same faint crescent birthmark near her collarbone. But the photo was taken in a hospital bassinet I had never seen, and the date stamped in the corner was 3 days before my sister ever called me, 3 days before I even knew the baby existed. I told him he had the wrong house, but my voice didn't sound like mine, and he didn't argue, didn't get louder. Just tilted his head slightly like he was waiting for me to catch up to something I was missing, then said my sister's name softly, like it meant something different coming from him. I shut the door and slid the deadbolt into place, my heart hammering so hard it blurred my vision, and for a second I just stood there staring at the wood, listening, expecting him to pound again or shout or leave. But there was only silence, which somehow felt worse. From the living room, I could hear the TV murmuring low and the soft, uneven breathing of my niece asleep in her playpen. And that normal sound made everything else feel wrong, like the house had shifted without me noticing. I moved back slowly, each step careful, crouching beside her and brushing my fingers over her blanket just to ground myself, just to make sure she was still here, still ours. But the image of that photo wouldn't leave my head. The hospital tag on her wrist, a number I didn't recognize. We had adoption papers, signatures, a sealed file our lawyer said covered everything. And I remembered sitting in that office being told it was straightforward, that no father had been listed, that there would be no complications. But now that certainty felt thin, like something I'd accepted because I needed it to be true. I stood and glanced toward the door again, then moved to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to see out without being seen, my breath catching when I spotted him still there on the sidewalk, not pacing, not calling anyone, just standing perfectly still and watching the house like he knew I'd come back. My phone buzzed in my hand, sharp and sudden, and I flinched, expecting my husband. But the screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen since the funeral. My sister's. And for a second I couldn't process it because that number had been disconnected. I'd watched them shut it off myself, but the message was already there, already opened, like it had been waiting for me. "Don't let him take her." I stared at the timestamp, my stomach dropping as I realized it hadn't been sent weeks ago, hadn't been sitting there unnoticed. It had been sent less than an hour ago, which meant one thing I couldn't explain. Someone still had her phone, and outside, the man lifted his head slightly, like he knew exactly when I'd read it. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, my thumb hovering like touching it might make the words disappear, because that number shouldn't have been active. And yet there it was with a fresh timestamp, not old, not delayed, sent less than an hour ago, which meant someone still had access to my sister's phone and knew exactly what was happening right now. I forced myself to move and checked the window again, my breath catching when I saw him closer to the porch this time. Not knocking, not shouting, just watching the house with a kind of controlled patience that felt deliberate, like he was holding himself back, like he knew pushing too hard would make me shut down completely. I stepped away from the curtain and grabbed the adoption folder from the kitchen drawer, flipping it open with shaking hands, scanning every page slower this time, not for what was there but for what wasn't. Because the sections were too clean, too final, no father listed, no contest, just my sister's signature and a notarized statement declaring she was the sole parent. And I remembered how relieved I'd felt reading that the first time, how easy it made everything. But now it felt curated. Like something had been simplified before it ever reached me. My phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't just text. It was a photo loading in piece by piece until it snapped into focus, and my stomach dropped. Because it was my sister late in her pregnancy, standing in a room I didn't recognize, her hand resting on her belly while someone else took the picture. And in the mirror behind her, half caught in the reflection, was him. Same face, younger but unmistakable, standing close enough that his presence didn't look accidental. His hand hovering near her back like he belonged there. I didn't realize Dee made a sound until my niece stirred and let out a soft whimper, snapping me back as I rushed to her and lifted her into my arms, holding her tighter than usual, my eyes flicking toward the door because the silence outside had stretched too long again. Then the doorknob moved, not violently, just once, a firm test, and my heart slammed into my throat because I knew I'd locked it, knew the deadbolt was set, and that small movement felt like a boundary being quietly challenged rather than broken. I stepped back instinctively, clutching her against me, my mind racing through options. Call the police, call the lawyer. But none of them felt simple anymore, because if what he was saying was even partially true, this wasn't just a threat at my door. It was something legal I didn't fully understand yet. "Check the file again." His voice came through the door, lower now, controlled, like he was choosing every word carefully. "The original one." And something about the way he said original made my stomach twist because we had only ever been given one version, or at least that's what I'd believed. I set my niece down gently and went back to the folder, forcing my hands to steady as I turned each page more carefully, paying attention to the details I'd ignored before. The slight misalignment near the back, the way the staple marks didn't match, the faint impression of something thicker that had once been clipped there. I angled the last page toward the light, my breath catching when I noticed it. A second signature pressed into the paper without ink, deep enough to leave an imprint but not a name, like someone had signed and then removed the page entirely. And even without seeing the full word, I recognized the first letter, the same one I'd just seen in the message header and in my sister's photo. And my hands started shaking again, because it meant he hadn't forced his way into this story. He had been part of it from the beginning, and someone had made sure I never saw that part until now. The curve of that first letter pressed into the paper wasn't enough to read the full name, but it was enough to match what I'd just seen in the reflection and heard through the door, and the realization hit hard and clean. He hadn't inserted himself into this. He'd been there from the beginning, and someone had removed him before the file ever reached me. The doorknob shifted again, firmer this time, not breaking the lock but testing it, and I forced myself to move instead of freeze, lifting my niece and stepping back toward the kitchen as I said I was calling the police, my voice steadier than I felt because I needed it to be. Needed him to hear that I wasn't completely powerless. "You can," he said through the door, calm but tighter now, like the control was starting to strain. "But they're going to ask why a father listed on the original paperwork was never notified." And that word again, original, landed heavier this time because now I could see the physical proof of it in my hands. I set my niece down just long enough to go back to the folder and examine the spine instead of the pages, prying it open carefully until I felt resistance. Something thin tucked inside, not obvious unless you were looking for it, and my stomach dropped as I slid out a sealed sleeve, older paper inside, different letterhead, something that didn't match the rest of the clean, finalized documents we'd been given. My hands shook as I opened it and unfolded the page, my eyes locking on the title at the top. Voluntary relinquishment, pending father notification. And beneath it, in clear type, was his full name, not missing, not scratched out, fully acknowledged like he'd always been part of this process, and I'd been handed a version where he didn't exist. I heard a dull thud from the front door and looked up just in time to see it press inward against the chain. Not enough to break it, but enough to remind me how little separated us. And for the first time, his voice wasn't completely steady when it came through. Lower, closer, edged with something raw. "She told me you'd keep her safe until I found you." And the way he said it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like something he'd been holding on to. I looked back down at the document and forced myself to read every line, not just the parts that scared me, my eyes catching the date, the signatures, and then the note typed beneath. Delay filing at mother's request, father to be notified upon stabilization. And next to it, in my sister's handwriting, uneven but unmistakable, were the words, "If anything happens to me, tell him the truth." My knees weakened as the pieces finally locked into place. Not a stranger showing up to take something that wasn't his, but a man who had been deliberately kept out while my sister tried to control the timing. A plan that fell apart the moment she died. leaving him searching and me believing a version that was never complete. The chain creaked again as the door shifted under pressure, and this time I stepped forward instead of back, my heart pounding so loud it drowned everything else out because the fear hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. No longer just about losing her, but about understanding what she had actually wanted. I stopped inches from the door, staring at the narrow gap and the shadow of him just beyond it, both of us silent for a second that stretched too long. And then he spoke again, quieter now. "I'm not here to take her from you." A pause, a breath. "I'm here because she's mine too." And I believed him more than I wanted to, which made the decision in front of me heavier than anything the paperwork could decide. I reached up slowly and wrapped my fingers around the chain, feeling how small it was, how temporary, and realized this wasn't about whether he existed or whether the law had failed us. It was about which truth I was willing to stand on, the one that let me keep her without question, or the one that meant sharing her with someone my sister never meant to erase. And as I held that chain in my hand, I understood that whatever I chose next wouldn't just change what happened at this door. It would decide what kind of promise I was keeping to my sister, and what kind of future I was building for her child. And then slowly, I lifted it,